Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. We are here from the Ann Arbor District Library with Fatema Haque and Sheela Lal to discuss Futureface by Alex Wagner. This is their Unerased Book Club pick for this month. Before we get started, I don't know if everyone wanted to go through and just introduce themselves and say a little bit about themselves so that we have some familiarity when we're speaking with each other. So I can start off since I'm already talking. I'm Lucy. I am a library tech at the library, and I work in the youth department. I do a lot of story times and youth programming. Then I also do a lot of book related events those are mostly for adults as well.
I can go. My name's Marissa. I am in the outreach department at the Ann Arbor District Library. I do a lot of LGBTQ programming, trying to do more teen stuff, just anything that will bring more people into the library and feel welcome.
And my name is Jacob. I also work in the outreach department, and I'm trying to do those same things that Marissa's doing. Reach out to the community in all sorts of ways.
I'm Elizabeth, and I work in the archives department. So we have a large collection of negatives and newspaper articles. The bulk of it is from the Ann Arbor News, but we also have some other stuff and always looking to expand. So working on digitizing and then customer service stuff, working the desk. And I also help with the summer game, which is super fun.
I'm Fatema. I am a facilitator for the Unerased Book Club, and I'm also the president of the Board of Rising Voices, which is an organization serving Asian Americans in the state of Michigan and encouraging civic participation.
And I'm Sheela. I'm the founder of the Unerased Book Club and a co-facilitator with Fatema, and I serve on the C4 arm of the Rising Voices organization. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into why I picked this book. I picked Futureface because, number one, there's so few books written by and about Burmese Americans. And I had the opportunity to go to Burma in 2014 and really think a lot about how countries in a lot of parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia just get completely overlooked. And people who are part of those diasporas aren't able to access necessarily publishing. So it was really interesting to read a memoir by a journalist who identifies as multiracial, specifically Burmese American. So that's where I'm going to open it and contextualize why this book was chosen. But I'm going to open it up by asking people, what did you think about the book?
I'll jump in. I have obviously an interest in this topic as someone who works in the archive. And I've also read similar books about people like digging into their genealogy. But I also thought like the aspect of her going back to Burma and just not being able to find any really archival material whatsoever was really like fascinating and sad at the same time. So I really enjoyed the book.
Also, before other people contribute, I want to recognize that Dim joined. And so Dim, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Dim. Sorry, I'm actually just like parked in my car because I'm leaving the country soon. So just been running around doing errands. I'm an organizer with Rising Voices. I want to thank Fatema for inviting me, and I'm grateful to be here. I was born in Burma. I'm an ethnic Darim Chin, so I don't identify as Burmese, but as Chin, as a Chin person from Burma. And we immigrated when I was 7, and I grew up in Tulsa and then graduated recently from the University of Michigan and am working for Rising Voices.
Awesome.
Well, welcome. I really enjoyed this book. I thought multiple facets of it were just really interesting, and the way she explores, the piece in Burma, the piece with her father in Luxembourg, and then I thought the whole part with the DNA testing was really eye-opening, and so I just found myself like sharing bits of this information that I was getting from this book with anyone who would listen around me. So I enjoyed it.
Yes, this book definitely made me think about how the narratives, the stories that families pass down from generation to generation those omissions, the things we purposely leave out, the things that we might not so consciously leave out, those things then become our histories. I'm thinking about like all the things that my family has kind of passed down over the generations, and it's like, I would be interested to go on such a quest as well. I think something that the book taught me is that there might not be a huge payoff. There isn't. It's a lot more complicated than that.
I love that you brought this up, because I think one of the things that I was thinking about while reading this book is like, well, what is she owed, right? What are we all owed by our parents or our grandparents, especially if they're coming from an era where there, or a location where there was a lot of trauma, you know, whether it was war or you were displaced, or you know, like with me and coming from Bangladesh, like my family, I know that my dad lived through an independence war, you know, a famine, lots of other issues within the country. And so, but we've never spoken about it. Neither have I spoken about it with my grandmother, you know. So it's just, I keep coming back to this question of what are we owed by our family, our ancestors, and are we allowed to ask for those stories?
Yeah, you could see a difference even in the way her parents were willing to give that information when she asked. You know, actually her father seemed more hesitant, like, well, I've told you, and that's the story. Whereas her mother seemed more willing to give information, but, you know, but it is interesting to think about it in terms of like, what should she have asked those questions of them to begin with, or expected them to answer when she did ask, I guess.
So for listeners to this recording who may not know, the Futureface is a nonfiction book. It's an exploration of the author's personal histories, family histories, and then later an exploration into like, what does identity mean in the context of DNA testing? And kind of to your question, Fatema, about what are we owed, I oscillate between wanting to find sources that aren't like my parents or family members' stories, but at the same time recognizing that in order to have those like scholarly or other narratives existing about cultures that come from like, basically like if you come from a culture that doesn't have an archival like culture, which is slightly a weird way to put it, but if you come from a culture that doesn't write things down, that passes things down orally, what else can you, like, what other way can you turn to get a fuller idea of self than from asking your family or other people in your community? And if we expect not to be owed anything by anyone, does the idea of culture die out? Does it like just disappear? And I think about this a lot with regards to like the South Asian, specifically Indian diaspora, where there's a very specific narrative that's told, a very specific story that's told, because most of us haven't been allowed out for socioeconomic and caste reasons. So what does it mean to form identity or in a culture in proximity to people who you fundamentally don't share a lot in common with? I think about it in a very insular way, but then expanding out. Alex Wagner, the author of this, talks a lot about, in her interviews, creating an idea of culture in proximity to whiteness in the US, and like, what does that look like and mean?
Yeah, Sheela, what you said about like even having very like singular and dominant narratives in the diaspora is a part of the issue with retaining culture. So like full honesty, I haven't read the whole book. I read a lot of excerpts of it, and I think I've actually read more of her articles and different things that she's written, because last year when COVID was kind of at its height, I reached out to her if she could to kind of just share like this fundraiser that we were making for the Chin community in Tulsa. And she actually did it. So that was like my like only interaction with her that was like very direct. And so that got me into reading more about like a lot of reviews about the book, interviews, finding and seeking out more Burmese narratives. And I think like a lot of my views on like writing about Burma, writing about diaspora has really been changed and shifted in the past 5 months because of the coup. And in a way, I think Burmese, like ethnically, because she's ethnically Bema on her mom's side, and that's really, really different from being Chin. So Chin people are an indigenous minority from the hills of Burma. We're a Christian minority as well. And we make up less than 1% of the country, whereas the ethnic Bema make up 60%. So I always find this weird, like, I find myself relating more to other working class first generation narratives more so than other Burmese narratives. So that was kind of what I felt when I would read some certain like stories of her, because I know her mother came here for undergraduate at Swarthmore and things like that. So it's a very like privileged narrative that I associate with a lot of East Asians and high caste South Asians. So I think in that sense, to me, like I don't share a lot of class nor background similarity with her. And I really, really have resisted being identified as Burmese because a lot of Chin and different ethnic people see the Bema as a colonizing force. They're essentially an occupying force. So I think it was interesting to read this narrative where it's like all of those things are true, and yet all of us have this very tenuous like grasp on our histories, and that kind of rings true kind of regardless of like your standing in your community.
I thought I really enjoyed this book a lot. I particularly enjoyed the part where she was talking about kind of the seductive nature of having pride in your heritage, where she was talking about being Bama and kind of almost wanting to just like fully let herself believe that that group was, you know, the top socioeconomic group because of hard work or because of, you know, they were better in some way or something like that, and how she really had to say like, no, that's not it at all. And then also, of course, the relationship with like colonization and British, and like how the British really like solidified a lot of those structures, which is so interesting. I mean, we talk about colonization here in terms of like more like, you know, people coming here, but it's a different kind of colonization. It's all, you know, I don't know how to quite put that in words, but yeah.
I mean, the three people from Rising Voices on this call are all byproducts of countries formerly imperialized by the British. So it's like very much part of how we talk about self. And I totally get what you're saying.
I think to your point, Dim, about how I think one of the things that Alex Wagner did really well is talk about complicity and kind of recognizing that you know, regardless of where we are, whether we, you know, like we are colonized, but we can also be a colonizing force. So as you were mentioning, and recognizing her family status in that, and recognizing some of the dynamics around that, especially whether it was like with ethnic minorities in Burma or it was with Indian immigrants to Burma, and all of those other which that was actually kind of a surprise to me, because some of the framing at the beginning when she was talking about farming and how once Burma was colonized and kind of made into this hub of rice production, and about how they had to take, a lot of landowners had to take loans out for doing more, and that a lot of the loans came from India. I assume that India might be seen as a colonizing force, but then to hear about the working class coming in and working for Burmese families and the tensions between them, I was also again very surprised. But then again, there are layers upon layers of this, and I appreciate the way that she explores like how complicit are we, and because regardless of what position you have, there's still some power dynamics that you get to navigate, and you get to either do good or harm in that space.
Yeah, I appreciated that she called attention to the complicity, and then also just to the complexity of like the layers that you're talking about with like how I forget if it's her mother or grandmother, was talking about, you know, she would basically use like a slur to refer to Indian men, but then also like she would intentionally seek out and like befriend African Americans here. And it was just like this very complicated view of race and how it's different in different places. And I thought it was like very interesting, all of it.
Yeah, I think she, at one point, she said something about like history. It doesn't have a starting point and an ending point, and it's sort of like you just take, you choose the story at some point that's the most convenient for you to tell, and that's, you know, that's what history is. It's from the teller. So I think that's kind of like what she was doing with this book a little bit, was maybe trying to push those directions past the little piece of history that she'd been given. And I think she did a good job, in my opinion. Like, I think she wasn't easy on her parents. She wasn't, you know, she was willing, I think, to look into, as you're saying, like the complicity and the more truth than her parents had told her.
Elizabeth, from your perspective as an archivist, what were you hoping to see, or in both her explorations in Europe and in Burma, and what was surprising?
Like I said before, I was really struck how she kind of met that. I didn't really expand on it, but she did see a hint of an archive in Burma, in the form of the collector that just got stuff like off the street and from people who are selling their collections or just getting rid of them. So I thought that was interesting. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that like, and I thought the Luxembourg exploration was also interesting. Like, she just had such a different time in each setting based on like what the barriers to access were. And in Burma, they were extremely difficult to get through, as well as her not speaking the language there. So that was another barrier for her to get through. And I thought it was interesting as well how she was like wanting her ancestry to be Jewish. And I know that's like actually a common thing that can happen when you get the DNA testing. And I also thought, going back to the DNA testing, and I think someone touched on it, that it's based on like populations, and they're like, what populations? And so the pools that they're coming from, they're just totally generalizing their population. Like, it's like 100 people to represent a country with millions of people, or an area with millions of people. So I didn't ever actually know anything about that. And I've read about genetic genealogy, so that was kind of surprising to me. And they're very not transparent at all with that.
I was also really quite flabbergasted by the Church of Latter-day Saints and how their archival practices. I just wanted to throw that out there. That was something that I had completely new information that really kind of took the rug out from under me. I still don't know exactly what to make of it.
Yeah, I was aware of that, but I guess I didn't realize that they were kind of like recruiting the dead to be a part of their religion, which I don't know. That was just next level. I don't know what to say about it, honestly.
Yeah, I think I knew about that as well. I can't remember where I learned it. I feel like it was in my graduate program. But one of the things that actually bothered me was how judgmental that she was about the lack of records, or the state of the records in Burma. I think that one of the things that are one of the aftermath of colonization is the fact that a lot of countries were stripped of their records and of their keepsakes and memorabilia. This is the first time I'm learning about Burma and what's contained there, but I mean, I know that with India, a friend of mine is currently doing her thesis on the India Office Library in London, and how it contains a lot of contents that, you know, that India specifically has requested access to and even back. And there's been just like a flurry of activities around how do you go about acknowledging what's in there, because it's such a broad request and search. So it's almost like unless a researcher can get themselves to that office in London, they just would not be able to do any of their own history work. And so most of what is contained is Indian history going back centuries. And so just to have that kind of sense of judgment of like, oh, this wasn't preserved, and it was written on a banana leaf, or like or that this is so disorganized, or any of those criticisms, I found that to be almost unempathetic. And that was really hard for me, because I know that it's very obvious the way she talks or the way she writes, that she understands the context of colonial powers. And so it was just, I'm not sure what to make of that.
Yeah, it was striking when she then almost has a moment of self-realization where she's like, I guess it makes sense that a country who's been through like a coup and a lot of like upheaval wouldn't have a lot of records still there.
Yeah, because they were like intentionally destroyed.
Yeah.
So that's what struck me too, is that like, yes, people want there to be an archive, and there could be, but because of all this political upheaval, there isn't. And yeah, I think that like she could have done a better job of framing that in a way that was more empathetic. That's kind of what I looked at it though as, is like, I guess through an idealism frame of like, she totally understands this. And yeah.
Which is why I felt so strongly about finding a book like this. Is this will probably be one of two books that anybody will read in their lifetime on the idea of Burma, unless they are more invested in these stories. And I think like she knows that, as somebody who works in media and works in journalism, like recognizes the power of contextualizing stories, and still didn't take that extra effort to ensure that the reader fully understands why archives do or don't exist in certain parts of the world. Like, it's very easy to remake the idea of a national identity if you don't have primary sources to counteract that or to contradict what people in power are saying. That's like a one paragraph that you can throw in there, make it like very clear to readers, or like the context of how the British, when they left, took things that they thought were important because they also didn't want any sort of like evidence trail. I lived with somebody when I lived in Calcutta who worked in the Calcutta archives, looking at the first newspaper in Asia, which was written by and like published and managed by an Irishman. It had anything to do with people in Calcutta. So all of the primary sources that he got to see in these archives were written by the colonizer and like imperial forces, even if it was by an Irishman, and there's complexity there. And when I asked, like, would you at all ever be interested in writing a period piece, like a fictional period piece on like the Bengalis who lived there? And he's like, I can't do that. Like, we don't know anything about them. This is kind of like a throwback to our conversation on Passage West. Like, we don't know anything about them. Why I can't write anything that remotely rings true. And I just keep thinking about like, what artifacts, what writings, what like pieces of history do we consider worthwhile in saving? And we meaning like our collective. So the tangent of her finding that guy who was picking up random pieces of memorabilia is really doing this incredible job of finding this well-rounded idea of what it means to be in Burma at that time. But all of the pieces of archival work brought back a lot of feelings of like, whose history do we deem to be most important in saving and preserving in very specific ways. And then like another quick story on that, like I knew somebody from when I lived in Sri Lanka on a Fulbright who eventually did her own personal family archival work, but had like so many primary sources, whether it was journals, diaries, or people still living. And I I still feel very jealous that I don't get to have that. Like my family doesn't have those records. I don't speak Hindi very well. I can read Hindi, but not that well. So even if I went on this quest to find parts of my family's history, it's by design completely lost to me. And there's a lot of people in this world who just will never have access to their own history like that. So that like the first half of the book got me in my feelings, and the second half, or I guess the first third, the second third, I was like, oh, cool. So your dad's family had all these resources or all these like, potential pieces in the archive. Like, boo.
I also thought it was telling that she did go to England and find more information there. Like you're saying, like the colonizer has much more information, and yeah, it's told through their lens. So how useful is that information to you as a researcher and as someone who is not interested in their story?
What's really interesting is like how I was able to read a lot of excerpts of this book as like a contrast to, I would say, like another famous book about Burma. Like probably the two most famous ones are this, and then the other one is Miss Burma by Charmaine Craig, whose family actually comes from like a long line of like Karen, which is one of the other persecuted minority groups in Burma, like a long line of Karen activists and guerrilla fighters and things like that. And the two are very, very, very different in terms of like, one of them is more story based. It's really about almost viewing the family as kind of sprouting out of like family mythologies and things like that, whereas this one is very rooted in archival work and history and research. And it was for one of my history classes, and we had to kind of compare and contrast, like, why did they seek out the methods that they did? Were they mostly oral interviews? Was it DNA research? Was it primary, secondary research? And I think reading these two together, like the excerpts together at once, had the most full picture of Burma that I've ever read in some sort of mainstream setting. Because when I would get frustrated with like Alex Wagner's portrayals of her family and I think her inclination to be very skeptical, which I think is healthy, but she also went into a lot of this kind of seeking answers for her son, which I think is really vital, that motivation is there. Whereas the other book was more about like trying to recapture memories that were lost. So like I felt like her guardedness almost and her apathy was a result of like grasping for something that I don't really think can be reclaimed anymore, because of colonization, because of imperialism. Like in my family, when I took like a DNA test as well, which was really funny, it said I was like 80% Vietnamese and Chinese, because they just don't have any data on like people of Burmese descent or Myanmar descent. So I think like I didn't read it so much as just like apathy because she wasn't aware, but it was a very human reaction to this consciousness that like she can never have these answers because of imperialism.
So in one of the interviews I listened, or conversations that was recorded that I was listening to, Alex talks about DNA testing and what does that mean for this very intangible idea of culture and identity. And I'm just curious if people have thoughts on that very broad idea.
It is funny to think about, you spitting in a tube and then you're getting this like percentage breakdown of what you are. And she was kind of talking about how, it might bring people to like, oh, I'll take off my French beret and then really I should be wearing a Scottish kilt because I am whatever percent Scottish, and like how it's all kind of like silly that you're trying to claim something that like through your blood and not necessarily through like culture, this living thing. And that's so interesting. And I do remember seeing commercials for Ancestry. I don't remember which company it was, but I remember seeing like TV commercials and like, oh, here's a white woman talking to a black man, but oh, they're both like the same percentage from like some country. And it's like, oh, like we're all human. And how like kind of silly some of this is. It is also interesting just because, so I studied anthropology, and so much of what we did was about race and how race is a construct and like not really real, and there's more genetic variation in a race than between races. And so it's kind of like hard to mesh those concepts that like race is a construct, but also there are these tags that they're looking for, but it's all based in like weirdly eugenic, like pure blood samples. Like it's very uncomfortable to think about, and its implications of how that might be used, let alone the data of like then who owns your DNA. There's just a lot going on in that section.
I think just like the, I guess, inaccuracy, like I don't really know a lot about it, but it just sounds like it's pretty inaccurate based on the where they get their samples from, how many samples they have, and like the amount of Scandinavian that everybody apparently has in their blood.
And to piggyback on what y'all had just said, for some people, it's like a huge deal to receive this extremely inaccurate and more or less useless data, and it makes you think about people in my life who have, you know, really kind of decided to personally invest in these DNA tests. And it's just like, man, it's sad somebody's going to tell you that, like, that ain't it. Like, that's not.
Well, yeah, and then it greatly influences like where you hang your identity hat, you know, I mean, like everyone here is saying, but you know, and they each took multiple tests. So it's like, how are you going to decide? You know, it's kind of like this, I'm going to keep taking this until I get the answers that I want, you know? So it seemed like a little bit of a backwards process, but it also indicated how false all of these tests were across the board. And I did think it was funny how her mother, like she would tell her mother, you know, findings from her tests, and her mother would attribute some quality in herself that she didn't like to some, you know, piece of her genealogy. Oh, that must be where I got that. Oh, that must be where I got that, you know. So it does seem like an interesting way to choose your identity, I guess. But it's also like a lot of people, I mean, we learn, we get our identity in some ways from our family. It's informed. So it's sort of it's an interesting puzzle, I guess.
And on the flip side, I've seen so many stories of DNA tests gone wrong, of like finding secret families or finding that you are not part of the family the way you thought, which is like the microcosm of how do you build culture and a sense of self. And the ethics of DNA testing, the ethics of like, or not even ethics, like the legality of law enforcement using DNA testing from private companies without consent, like really weirds me out. And that's probably my number one reason why I would never contribute my DNA willingly to a private company. Like that, like the messiness of like bioethics and like biotech, and how do we know how far this, like how far a company is going to go with our, essentially like our own intellectual or like biological property. I have a lot of weird feelings reading this that like regurgitated in like my feelings about bioethics that I try to keep very under control.
I think I feel exactly the same way that you do, Sheela, because I'm also like consistently worried about just like, okay, so if somebody, you know, owns a segment of my DNA because they mapped it out or whatever, like how, just the idea of human ownership in that way just freaks me out. But, and all the other things, I think I am highly skeptical. And I don't think that unless there is like some serious, I guess, policies and things that are and regulations in place around this, I don't think I could go into it. I think enough of myself is being tracked in our current social media setups and everything else that I don't think I need to add blood to the mix. That just no. So. But I do understand like its usefulness for folks who are really searching for identity, searching for a sense of self. I mean, I think Wagner starts with this idea of solitaire, right? And being an only child who constantly felt very alone, and also very othered because of appearance and where she grew up. And I think that's a really familiar, like I was drawn to this book particularly because of this idea of belonging, right? And I was reading Brene Brown's The Wilderness book at the same time, which really talks about how do you actually find belonging and a sense of community and a place. And it was just, in some ways, I felt like Wagner wasn't really doing that, because Brene Brown's entire argument is like, you have to be vulnerable and you have to be courageous and you have to know your values and stand true to those values, right? While at the same time being open and receptive to new ideas and experiences, and to other people. And I think Wagner almost like, instead of being in this, she often put up walls, right? And so the research became a wall, or looking up things became a wall, or traveling here to there, or trying to interpret the history became a wall, as opposed to, this is going to be a point of connection. Even when she got her cousin, I think, to go to Burma with her and to help contribute to the research, there wasn't this deep connection. There was almost like, at least the way it was written was, I'm going to hide my ignorance from my cousin, who is this, PhD student, or and I'm going to again keep a barrier up. So I feel like in every step where she could have found belonging and she could have found connection, she didn't. She just withdrew from it. I see you nodding, Jacob.
And this is kind of harkens back to the intro in the first little bit. People find belonging quite often by excluding others. That was a notion that I had never considered before. And I think that I see throughout the book, she's putting up that wall, and that wall can be a little bit exclusionary. Sorry, Alex Wagner.
I think she even had moments, I mean, just in general with her encounters with people in this book, that seemed, I don't know if glib's the right word, but she would say, and I feel like maybe she was trying to be funny, but she would say like, I talked to this woman, but I couldn't understand anything she was saying because her teeth were so crooked. And I'm like, that woman might read this book because you talked to her. And like, or in the end, she had something about all those big butt, nacho eating, some, it's just like, so these little snippets of just seeing how judgmental she could be. And I don't know if she was trying to bring levity to it, but I think to provide humor at the expense of someone else is never that funny. So I did find that her voice did kind of slip into that that judginess, and I was surprised by that she put it in there, and that, like, this is edited. I don't know. It makes her seem mean and mean-spirited. So, and sorry, Alex Wagner, but you put it in there.
I had no idea what to do with that. And by that, I mean the tone in the writing style of the book itself. Sometimes it felt like when, I don't know, maybe you're at a social event and your aunt comes up behind you and grabs your arm and whispers something kind of mean in your ear, and you go, oh, that's what it felt like to me. You're like, oh, why'd you say that to me? But also like, oh, I'm doing it like a gross little laugh just to make you feel better about you saying that crappy thing you just said to me. It felt, it had big drunk aunt energy. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't see how it lent itself to the content.
I mean, I think about this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I listened to the audiobook, which is, it's her voice. She recorded it. And I think she used to work for she just did podcasting and it like very much had that tone to me, which came through very strongly when she was reading it. Because it did sound like, a very produced podcast, like just a long podcast. And so I kind of was taking it as like trying to be glib, but yeah, it was a little rough, especially like with this, laughing at how they were spelling, I think it was report or something like that, and kind of laughing at these stupid people don't know how to spell report. But it's, yeah, it
had like really strong first gen diaspora, I've never questioned anything about like where I come from energy of like, and I finally have the opportunity to go back. Like the number of Indian Americans I interacted in while living in India who would say really messed up stuff about their surroundings. I'm like, no one asked you to come back. You don't have to be here and it's okay. You can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. But I've heard that sentiment from my friends who are Pakistani, my friends who are Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, even Chinese. And I'm just like, oh goodness. And that's like, that was such a big cringe, like reconciliation that I had to like read. Like, ma'am, you were a grown woman who works, again, professionally in media. You don't have to do this. And you know that.
And I think it's like this, just because it is not within your consciousness or your knowledge levels, such as like the Yiddish thing, right? The Yiddish is like, who speaks Yiddish? Why would he know that, right? This whole thing about it. And she does recognize that she was kind of put in her place by the consultant that she was talking to about how prevalent it is and all of these other things. But it's just like, just because it is not in your awareness doesn't mean that it's not a part of the world. And I think that I've definitely experienced that, same as you, Sheela, where people have just like said all sorts of crap about Bangladesh, where and because I went back and lived there as an adult for a few years, I would have to like deal with this very superficial look at the country or its politics or its infrastructure or any number of things. And it was always very upsetting. And I felt very upset by a lot of the book where I think anytime she spoke of Burma and Burmese culture or Burmese people, she did it with this superiority and kind of centered the Western lens at every turn, you know? So if we're talking about tea time, we have to compare it to Jane Austen, or if we're talking about the history of the royal family and the dynasty, we have to reference Game of Thrones, you know, like all these different ways in which I was like, these things can stand on their own. This history can and is valid enough to stand on its own without having being juxtaposed against American culture.
I think that's truly why between the two books that we read, we got to like for my history class, we got to pick one that we wanted to read in its entirety. And for me, it was Miss Burma, which it was like from a mixed Karen woman perspective. And I think just not being an ethnic Burma person, I know that like most folks don't have that much interaction or exposure to anything about Burma, but I definitely do. And I see so many Burma perspectives that it's almost just like saturated with Burmese perspectives. So I'm always very curious about like non-Burma perspectives. And I think that's definitely how it read to me, like first generation, like immigrant diaspora American, really trying to understand to some degree, but not really getting that, like you can't really go to some country that you have tenuous or even strong ties to and expect the answers that you want. Like it almost did seem like I think, and like that's totally a mistake that I think almost all diaspora kids make. Like I certainly did. Like my plan was to return to Burma before COVID, and you know, obviously because of COVID and the coup, I can't. And I totally recognize that you want answers so badly. Like I haven't returned to Burma since we immigrated when I was 7, and one of my biggest life, you know, like goals is to return. But if anything, I'm kind of grateful to now get the time to reflect and think about what return means. The fact that I have an American passport, that I'm very, very privileged to return and be able to leave. Like even if I had been in Burma during the coup, I very likely, despite being an ethnic minority, would be fine because I hold an American passport. And I think you have to really critically think about all those things before you go back to anywhere that is a homeland of sorts.
I think what this book does well is have the reader consider what is identity, what is culture, what is my experience in those ideas. So between DNA testing and like this reimagining of identity, her trying to explore through archives as if like facts and figures and data is going to make your socialization. It's just really fascinating. And I mean, this conversation has been really helpful in like relocating what it means to be socialized in a place where you don't have access to your own history. And I'm thinking a lot about the conversations around like state legislatures choosing that they don't want a public school curriculum to include other narratives and other voices. And what does that mean in perpetuating harm to children who aren't white and whose families haven't been here for generations, who don't get to see that their stories are valid too. And that like, while like the idea, like, and I think she mentions this, like the idea of like your family story coming from, oh, we came because they were giving away land without recognizing the violence of what that means, like that the land was actively stolen from Indigenous people who were here. Like if you don't get that complexity, do you really get a full sense of your story and your history? So I think like really, unfortunately, it's timely in the current political conversation.
It was an interesting interrogation of kind of a very common white heritage narrative of like, our family came over looking for opportunity and we worked really hard and like we made it, like because that is like a very, you know, very saccharine, very common narrative that I've heard from many people. I mean, I know in grade school we had to do like, what is your family? Draw little flags. And it was always that story, like, yes, we came over here looking for opportunity and we found it and we worked hard and here we are. And I think, yes, recognizing like land and different advantages. And I think then it's also very interesting that just the Jewish complication of how she was almost looking for something else that, you know, that I'm not fully in a, you know, one of the oppressors, that maybe there's something in my history too. It's a very common thing she was talking about, and just how, yeah, just the complication of the white narrative and what it means, and all of that I thought was very interesting, and I appreciated that she was talking about that.
Yeah, I listened to an interview, I think it was like from the Atlantic magazine podcast. And it's like what you were saying, Sheela, before we started this, that some of the interviews you've listened to or watched, you wish that the things she said in that would have been in the book. She did say something about like whiteness getting collapsed into Americanness, or the other way around. So like to be American, like you don't have to identify that you're white if you're American. That's the default. And there's just such a, it is timely to have this right now, because that becomes more and more, you know, likely to remain if we just want to keep taking out the other stories. But, you know, I wish she'd said something like that a little bit more directly in the book.
And she talks a lot about amnesia in the book, but I think that this is the amnesia of white folks, right? Like this kind of erasure of like, how did we become as successful as we were? Like, what is the actual history that's being erased or forgotten in the process? It isn't a matter of we worked really hard and we were successful, right? So I think that's an interesting juxtaposition, at least for me, because her Burmese family remembers the good things and doesn't share the bad things, but then her white family does the exact same thing, only it's and on both sides I feel like it's either erasure of trauma or or oppression.
Well, we are just about at an hour, and I think there's a lot to think about in this book, critically in a lot of different ways. But if anyone else has anything that didn't get said that they're really wanting to add, now would be a time.
I'm just going to end like I always have been lucky to end our conversations, which is, if you want to continue engaging with the books, or if you want to join our book clubs, we want all readers to join. Ethnicity is no bar. We want people to engage with Asian American authors and Asian American literature in all the diverse ways that it presents itself. So unerasedbookclub.com is the website, and we send out monthly, bi-weekly emails, so we're not flooding your emails. And all we do is that you show up, be respectful, and communicate with us like we're doing here. And that's all I got.
And we also encourage you to, like, if you want to read these books with your friend groups and things like that, we have discussion questions on the website. Please do. We encourage you to make your own groups and enjoy the books, because we ultimately want more people to read Asian American authors.
Well, thank you very much, Sheela and Fatema, for leading us in conversation once again. It's been great. We really appreciate having you here. And we will look forward to the next discussion, which will be next month.
Yeah, and thank you, Dim, and everyone else for joining.
Thank you, Dim.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's nice seeing folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right, thanks.